Hello everybody, and welcome to this evening's Royal Conservatoire of Scotland Exchange Talk. I've posted the link for captioning in the chat, so you should have that now, and I'll post it again in a couple of moments. My name is Dr. Laura Bissell, and I'm interim head of the Contemporary Performance Practice programme, and I'm also a lecturer in research at the RCS. So I'm really delighted to be chairing this evening's event, and I'm about to welcome and introduce Aby Watson, our speaker tonight. But before I do that, I wanted to share with you the format of the evening. So Aby is going to speak for around 30 minutes. While she's speaking, you're welcome to use the Q&A function. So to access Q&A, you can click at the bottom and there's a little Q&A box. So you can add any questions that you have at any point during the talk, and we'll save these for the end. We'll have about 15-20 minutes at the end where we can have questions with Aby. So all attendees can add questions. You can also upvote questions or comment on them. So there is a chat box as well, and I can see people saying hello. So nice to see everybody. We've got a really good crowd in tonight. So I would encourage you to use the chat box to let us know of any issues or anything like that, and questions in the Q&A box would be perfect. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing Aby Watson, a doctoral researcher here at the RCS. Aby is a graduate of the Contemporary Performance Practice programme. She's a dyspraxic dance artist and practice researcher, and tonight she's going to be sharing her reflections on her performance Ish, a solo choreography of movement, text and object that works affirmatively with her own dyspraxicality, that is, the qualities and conditions of being dyspraxic. Ish was supported by an emerging artists commission from Unlimited in 2017, and it's since been performed nationally and internationally. So Aby's talk this evening is titled Dancing Dyspraxicality in the Performance of Ish. Welcome, Aby.
Thank you, Laura. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen with you all here. Okay. Fantastic. So thank you, Laura, and thank you everybody else for being here as well. My name is Aby Watson, and I am a Glasgow-based dance artist, performance maker, and PhD candidate at RCS. I am neurodivergent and have dyspraxia and dyslexia, and this is incredibly important to my outlook as a dance artist and is a crucial factor to my practice research. Today, I'm going to talk to you about my practice research and my solo dance performance Ish. I will specifically focus on the phenomenon of dyspraxicality or dyspraxic lived experience that is the subject of the performance. My PhD, Disordering Dance, applies a dyspraxic perspective to dance making and questions, how can I utilize my positionality as a dyspraxic dance artist to create radical and original dance? My research is not concerned with finding strategies to adapt myself and my dyspraxic nature to assimilate and conform to the normative standards of mainstream dance practice. Instead, I'm interested in purposefully leaning into qualities of dyspraxicness through dance with a productive, non-deficit and affirmative perspective. The standpoint of my research is heavily inspired by the affirmative model of disability. This model builds on the social model of disability, which argues that disability exists because of societal structures that exclude and disable people with impairments. However, the affirmative model draws on the idea of disability pride and the ethos of the disability arts movement and rejects pity, tragedy, or sympathy narratives of disability. This model argues that an individual's impairments are a crucial part of their identity, and I believe that my dyspraxicness, or my dyspraxicality, is a central part of my identity and is particularly fundamental to my identity and practice as a dance artist. So what do I mean by dyspraxicality? Dyspraxicality is a word that I have developed which adopts the word-forming element itty which means the condition and quality of being. This, dyspraxic plus itty, with an AL in there to make it easily soundable, becomes dyspraxicality, meaning the condition and quality of being dyspraxic, or the dyspraxic reality. This shifts the focus from impairment to experience and signifies the experiential knowledge that comes from a life of being dyspraxic. A viewpoint centered on dyspraxic experience extends further than the objective, medical, and deficit perspectives that are dominant in the medically saturated literature, which tends to focus on impairment, difficulty, and abnormality. Instead, dyspraxicality is a holistic term which suggests a different way of being, a different way to see the world through and to experience the world in, which decenters the notion of dyspraxia as a problem. In both the literature and in the common knowledge of dyspraxia, there is a focus on categorizing the condition on its physicality alone. The fact that it used to be called clumsy child syndrome evidences this well. Dyspraxia does have physical characteristics, which can manifest in awkward movement, poor balance, and poor manipulative skills, meaning that a dyspraxic person may be prone to tripping over, bumping into objects, and spilling liquids. However, there is a significant cognitive profile to dyspraxia, which can produce difficulties regarding executive planning, organization, language, and perception, and can affect the daily life of the dyspraxic through forgetfulness, disorganization, and difficulties with absorbing information quickly and navigating new places. Being dyspraxic in a non-dyspraxic world, especially when undiagnosed, can have further consequences and can significantly affect the dyspraxic's emotions, mental health, and behaviors. The condition and quality of being dyspraxic stretches across physical, cognitive, emotional, social, and behavioral characteristics. Dyspraxia is not just a part of my life and myself that exists alone and switches on at particular moments. It is in my neurology and it frames my entire experience. Dyspraxicality as a term seeks to address the breadth of this experience. The word also encompasses the relativity of dyspraxia as it exists on a spectrum, with dyspraxic traits varying widely between individuals. Each dyspraxic reality is different and unique, and dyspraxicality as a term seeks to address that. Ish is an expression of dyspraxic subjectivity through dance performance. The project began in March 2017 when I was awarded an Emerging Artists Commission from Unlimited. I began to develop the work shortly after that and showed an initial work in progress at Buzzcut Double Thrills at the Centre for Contemporary Arts in February 2018. I then premiered a full performance of Ish at the South Bank Centre in September 2018 at their Unlimited Festival. Since then, the work has been performed across the UK and internationally at Tramway in Glasgow, Sophia and Sailor in Berlin, and Wales Millennium Centre as part of Cardiff Dance Festival, amongst others. The work has continually evolved with each performance, as I've redeveloped the work each time I've gone back into rehearsal. It has significantly changed since its premiere with various iterations of the work, and that may be evident in the documentation that I showed to you today. Through the project's time span, the creative team has included Daisy Douglas as producer, Luke Pell, Laura Bradshaw, and Tom Scullion as dramaturgical support, Eleni Tomadow as lighting designer, and neurodivergent choreographer Frauke Ruckart as mentor, alongside myself, naturally, who is the choreographer and performer. The central inquiry of Ish is the notion of in-betweenness. In her book, Choreographing Difference, The Body and Identity in Contemporary Dance, Cooper Albright discusses Western philosophy and the hangover of Platonic idealism, which understands the body as ignorant material that needs to be led by an intelligent mind. The ideologies of our mainstream culture prioritize intelligence of the mind and continue to understand the body as an unintelligent, uninformed entity. This enforces the notion of mind-body dualism and disconnects bodily experience from personal subjectivity. The body is perceived as other. Cooper Albright continues to discuss this idealism from the perspective of feminist scholars, stating that the construction of this initial dualistic paradigm in Western philosophy began an onslaught of oppositional binaries like mind-body, knowledge-experience, and objectivity and subjectivity. As our society operates on dualistic philosophies, disabled bodies are commonly categorized objectively by their physicality and have historically been tied to the material condition of their bodies, structuring an identity that has repeatedly been constructed as oppressively and basely physical. The subjectivity of a disabled body is seldom considered in mainstream society, and the subjectivity of what we consider as a disabled body is also not given much thought. This leads me to question the position of neurodivergent people in relation to dualistic and oppositional binaries. Neurodivergent conditions like dyspraxia are known as hidden differences and do not always have visual signifiers for their difference. Soft signs of their difference might be visible, for example, a dyspraxic's clumsiness, but the cognitive profile of the individual is likely to be a major, yet completely invisible aspect of their difference. Therefore, as neurodivergence is primarily about the mind and its processes, not the body, such hidden differences are rarely categorized as disabled identities, even though the individual might have disabled lived experience. In our objective and dualistic culture, dyspraxics are recognized as able-bodied, yet can have lived experience of disability due to the specific environments, requirements, structures, and norms of society which disable them. If we're thinking in tandem with dualism, then the neurodivergent mind is not perceived as the governing intelligent matter compared to the body, but is instead more likely to be classified as the messy, incoherent matter. The mind is then presented as other, not the body. The dyspraxic dancing body sits in a place that is between the oppositional binary of disabled and non-disabled that is predominant in mainstream society. And this is clear in my own experience in mainstream dance culture. For the most part, I physically adhere to the normative expectations of dancer. Yet I am not able to follow, process, learn, and memorize movement material at the same speed and in the same style that is normative to those environments. Such standards and practices have excluded me from participating equally, and that experience has had a significant impact on my life. Yet, at the same time, I've also been really wary of taking up too much space in disability dance culture, as I'm aware of the privilege I have as someone who, for the most part, passes as non-disabled and neurotypical, and whose experience of exclusion is perhaps lesser than those with physical or visual impairment. Ish is an expression of this in-between positionality and is the central theme of the work. The 50-minute or so performance is constructed through 7 performative vignettes, 5 of which center on exploring the continuum between different oppositional binaries. These dualistic binaries relate to my dyspraxic experience and act as titles for the vignettes and are projected onto the back wall of the performance space before the vignette begins. Visible, hidden. Order, chaos. Steady, wobbly. Rising, falling. Mind and body. Now, I'm going to share some film with you of Ish at Cardiff Dance Festival back in November 2019. Hopefully this isn't too laggy. The clip is around 5 minutes long, and is from the visible hidden vignette at the start of the work. Okay, here we go. Okay, hopefully we're all back. Apologies for that, and thank you very much for your patience in going away and watching that. I'm going to jump straight back in. As dyspraxia and dyspraxic experience cannot objectively be seen in the body, I needed to create strategies in Ish that translate dyspraxicality into visible and tangible concepts that can be witnessed by an audience. I did this through the use of objects and music, alongside the creation of specific rules of the performance space. There we go. Even though Ish is classified as a solo, I collaborated with various objects to create and perform movement material. Through performance, these objects become symbolic of dyspraxic experience, or even dyspraxic bodies, and are able to represent that experience in a more objective manner. I chose to work with objects that have their own unique dysfunctional movement qualities about them: helium balloons and a space hopper. These objects all have the potential for both equilibrium and conflict in relation to laws of gravity, force, and movement, all physiological elements that can be applied through human interaction and choreography. This gives them a sense of their own agency as they respond to external stimulus in a way that I can't always control. The balloons in the space hopper have the potential to burst and bang and slip away from grasp like thoughts in the dyspraxic mind. They can be disobedient, and through their actions can create moments of chaos, which is an aspect of dyspraxicality that I'm incredibly interested in. They are objects that are easily personified and become performers in their own right. These objects inherently invite and create movement, which in Ish is as important as the movement of my dancing body. There we go. There are 3 distinct balloon interactions in the work. The first is, as you have seen, where a bunch of white, bouncy helium balloons render me invisible. Then they become a sculptural object attached to a fan with blowing air that makes them move and shift constantly, an objectification of my own body's desire for constant movement. Then there are the gold balloons, with 3 bunches tied down to the corners of the playing space, and 1 gold balloon that takes a solo. The gold balloons are filled with different amounts of helium and room air, so that when they're all released at the end of the work, as you can see here, they're brought into movement. And there is a diverse landscape of movement between them. Although when they're still, they all look the same, and their difference is invisible. In movement, the balloons with less helium have a dampened quality, less of an exuberant buoyancy, but more of a considered and careful leisurely pace. These balloons literally move heavier, but with that comes a smoothness that is more at one with gravity and the surrounding environment. They are slower, but this is not a negative judgment. They take the time that they need. There is 1 balloon in the work that takes a solo. The intention for this balloon is that it's equidistant between rising and falling, to hang in the balance and to literally occupy the space in between. However, due to some difficulty of achieving this very careful balance of physics, it always falls, albeit after some time. It floats and it falls gracefully, slowly disrupting the normative standard of the balloon, which is to rise. After sinking, it resides on the floor, still upright and buoyant, and continues to respond to changes in the air as it makes its own path for the rest of the performance. The solo balloon is metaphoric for what I hope for the dyspraxic dancing body, for it to move in its own way, at its own pace, and to be celebrated for it. A white, large space hopper is used throughout the performance. However, unlike the balloons, it wasn't a part of the work's initial concept. Instead, it emerged through the creative process when on a residency with creative producer Daisy Douglas. The space we were in was in an old church, and there were lots of interesting objects and artifacts scattered around the studio. Daisy was trying to talk to me, and I was really tired, so I kept losing focus and getting distracted. I spotted a vintage 1970s space hopper and impulsively grabbed it and began to bounce on it. Then, very clearly, it was much easier for me to focus and engage in the conversation and we were both quite amazed at how effective it was. This phenomenon is noted by Kurtz, cited in Patrick, who states, "Some dyspraxics seem to crave motion as a result of being undersensitive to vestibular input and may seek out extra movement experiences in an effort to fuel their central nervous system with meaningful information. This is true for my dyspraxicality. Bouncing brings me equilibrium, which I have also found in other repetitive movements like skipping, swaying, swinging, and rocking. The idea of equilibrium through motion informs the material in the steady wobbly vignette, where I bounce on a space hopper from start to finish. I begin by bouncing steadily, bringing attention to the simple movement principles of up and down, as the bounce leads my body through the continuum of the horizontal, creating a solid repetitive beat as the hopper hits the floor. After bouncing the perimeter of the space, I find center stage and meet the audience's gaze, demanding their attention. Then a gestural choreography of the hands and arms begins, which sits on top of and in time to the continual rhythmic bounce. This purposeful, yet very simplistic show of repetitive movement and synchronous coordination denotes an alternative discipline and suggests an aesthetic of amateur virtuosity. There is skill and control here, but it is also undermined by the nature of the object that enables the movement, which is a children's toy and is not something to be taken seriously. There is humor in this conflict, as the image straddles dualistic ideas of serious and silly, adult and child, professional and amateur, continuums that I feel that I occupy. The gestural movement grows bigger and bigger until I throw my arms out repeatedly, which brings my body into a precarious state on the brink of losing control, which inevitably happens as the hopper escapes from the force. It throws me off spontaneously as I come down with a bump, as I watch it roll away, fleeing control. This is another dyspraxicality that the space hopper personifies throughout the work, the potential for mishap or accident, which is a constant consideration for the dyspraxic. The soundtrack for Ish comprises a selection of semi-improvised jazz recordings and primarily features the tracks by Charles Mingus. His piece Moanin' forms the central leitmotif of the performance. For me, the musical aesthetic of Moanin' resonates with qualities of dyspraxic thought. It is non-linear. It's busy, but it still has a holistic quality. The auditory synthesis of order and freeform work in tandem with the accompanying choreography. In the vignette Order Chaos, I dance a solo to Moanin', whilst an audience participant blows up the space hopper with a bellows pump in time to the music. At this moment, there are two solos happening at once. One is functional and linear, and one is expressive and non-linear. The choreographic structure of the dance is in chunks with a set through line and is made up of different scores of action-based movement that are arranged in moments of the music. However, the dancing itself is largely improvised and freeform, meaning that the material is both structured and non-structured and sits in a place between choreography and improvisation. Ish has a distinct performance system with its own rules, order, and dramaturgy of the space. There are two separate performative worlds at play in the work, the onstage and the offstage. Traditionally, all performance happens on stage and is visible to the gaze of the audience, whereas the backstage action is non-expressive, functional in nature, and is traditionally hidden from view. However, the staging of Ish maintains the traditional functionality of the on and off stage areas, but as there is no literal partition of space, only thick black tape stuck to the floor in the shape of a square, all offstage activity is visible to the audience. Inside of the square is the onstage, and outside of the square is the off. Consequently, the audience finds themselves privy to things that are traditionally hidden from view, and the normatively unseen elements of the performance are exposed. By purposefully uncovering offstage behavior, Ish continues its intention to make the hidden become visible and blurs the dichotomy of on and offstage spaces. The on and off stage worlds are signified by sign systems of lighting, sound, and projection, but also are signified in my behavior and position in the space. The states are triggered immediately when I either leave or exit the onstage area. When I am on stage, I am performing the consummate dancer as much as I possibly can. Each movement, action, and pause is facilitated with the utmost consideration, order, and control, an index to the pre-planned and rehearsed nature of the vignettes. Whereas in the offstage, this attention drops and I relax, ceasing to objectively perform. The offstage offers the opportunity for me to regulate myself between vignettes, both physically and mentally. I cough, take my inhaler to settle my asthmatic breath. I drink water. I also read the projected title to remember what vignette comes next, which is a strategic choice to relieve the pressure of holding the structure of the show in my head. I take a moment to be still, to process what has just happened before I go out and do it again. The offstage space allows me to drop the presentation of total control. I take the time that I need, and that steadies the performance to the speed of my thinking, which instills the function of Crip time. Crip time is a concept from Crip theory and culture to mean a reorientation of time that acknowledges and is flexible to the different temporal experience of disability. Feminist scholar Alison Cather writes that Crip time requires reimagining our notions of what can and should happen in time, or recognizing how expectations of how long things take are based on very particular minds and bodies. Crip time is a challenge to normative and normalizing expectations of pace and scheduling. Rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, Crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. The offstage moments of Ish pause the normative temporality of dance performance to meet the needs of my cognitive dyspraxicality. The structure of pausing in between vignettes gives me time to process and ground myself to avoid overwhelm, and doesn't hide or apologize for that, but instead weaves it into the dramaturgy of the work. Ish is a representation of subjective dyspraxic experience that brings dyspraxicality into the visible and tangible realm. With the use of movement, object, music, and dramaturgical rules, Ish signifies and objectifies the in-between positionality of the dyspraxic body and gives aesthetic form to dyspraxic knowledges of thinking and moving. However, this could be pushed much, much further. Ish initially intended to be unashamedly dyspraxic, but I don't feel that this is completely reflected in the work's form. Ish deals with dyspraxicality as its subject, but could further bring this perspective into the aesthetic values of the performance. For me, the work never fully escapes its own adherence to a neuronormative system, value system, and continues to defer to the neuronormative gaze of mainstream traditional dance practice. The aesthetic values of the work still privilege control, clarity, linearity, and theatrical performativity. There is little space in the work for forgetting, confusion, messiness, or instability, which I definitely felt the strain of throughout the process. I realized that normative values were still asserting themselves in my own subconscious, and that I was self-policing the work through the lens of those values. This deep entanglement with normative values forms a key line of inquiry in my research moving forward. To what extent can I separate or distance myself from these normative values, and what tools can help with this? Can active changes in my approach to process, form, and aesthetics push the work in a space that transcends or perhaps sidesteps neuronormative values of mainstream dance? Can dyspraxicality as a philosophical framework translate into a choreographic approach? If ish set to blur the lines between binary modes of thinking, how can I go further and attempt to destabilize those binaries in my future work? Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Aby. Thank you so much. That was great. That was great. And we've had loads of exciting questions coming in. We have quite a few there. I'll maybe just start off with the first one, if that's okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Yes, you can stop sharing your screen and then people will be able to see me too. Hello. So yes, and lots of lovely comments in the chat as well. So the first question is from Joe, and Joe says, really interested in how the dance industry have responded to the work and to the themes in the work. Has your own experience of the industry and your access to it shifted since making the work?
Yes, definitely. A big thing that I wanted to talk about in this talk, but I realized I didn't have all the time in the world, was talk about my experience as a dance artist, actually performing the work and touring the work, and my excess needs in relation to that. As I said, I kind of felt this. I felt a lot of strain during the process, and in the process of taking it places and performing it. And there's something there about how dyspraxia is a condition that is inherently about organization, and organization is difficult and tricky. So then when I am a dyspraxic dance artist and I am in charge of getting the work to a place, getting it in the place, getting it in, being the person that's the central port of call for all communication, has all the responsibility, I have found that really difficult, and actually that has been a huge factor for my experience of performing the work, because the majority of the time I've performed the work, I have not been ready to perform because I have been so entangled in my own attempt to organizing everything all at once that it really, literally the performance was like the last thing that got dealt with, when actually it should have been, I should have had time to prepare myself to perform rather than getting everything in place. So the organizational component of being a solo dance artist and what that means when you're showing work and touring work, and that has been a huge realization for me. And actually throughout the process, I've realized the value of human resources, and to the point where my partner Tom is very much like a PA in a lot of, a personal assistant in a lot of situations, because I will be so micro-focused, hyper-focused on the performance and getting everything prepared for the performance that I will forget to eat. I will forget to go to the toilet before the show starts. I will forget to drink water. Kind of basic human needs that when I'm in a hyper-focused state, I forget. So it's really important to have someone there who, yeah, is reminding me of those things. So yes, I've had a huge realization about the need for human resource as my access need, and having people to help me organize myself and the work. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Aby. I'll move us on to a question from Patricia. What strategies have you found to disrupt the binary and celebrate being in the in-betweenness? And is this something you would encourage in performer training?
Very good question. So just to repeat that back to you, so I'm fully on the same page. Strategies, you're asking me about strategies to deconstruct the binary, and what was the second bit, sorry?
Celebrate being in the in-between. You started talking about the ish, the in-betweenness. And Patricia's asking, is this something that you would encourage in performer training? So rather than being in these binary points, but actually being in this in-between space would be what I think Patricia's asking.
Definitely. I think in terms of performance training, I think it's incredibly important to work in a way that is in between things, particularly in terms of making your own work. Oh God, if I can remember, there's something that I've been looking at in my research that I can't quite remember the title of, which is frustrating, but it's the idea when two ideas overlap, it's the space in between that where the interest is. And I've been using binaries as that really. So taking these two binaries, what happens if there's that space in between and what that is. You were asking me about strategies to disrupt the binary through practice. Let me have a think about that. Well, I think, and this is something that I'm still definitely exploring, there's something for me in terms of, sorry, I'm losing my chain of thought here. The in-betweenness. Well, first off, a way of doing it is with the objects, I was very much exploring the in-between through play. So a lot of the way that I have made the work is through play and through playing. And I think that's why with objects, it was really easy for me to find what those binaries were and the space in between, because I can get to know them in a very tangible way. When playing with the space hopper, there is these binaries of up and down, tension, release, all of these binaries that I was finding through playing and interrogating an object. So for me, that was a way in to exploring that. But in terms of choreographically, this is something that coming out of Ish, I realized that I could have done way more in the process. I think I was using objects as a way in to find movement, but I wasn't as much playing with binaries of movement, and that is something that I definitely want to move more into. Yes, and I'll stop that there. Sorry, I don't think.
That's great. There's a few questions from John, but maybe one that kind of comes, there's a question about the mind-body kind of binary, but I wonder actually maybe off the back of what you were saying, John asks, do you see the potential for accident a source of creativity? I'm thinking of the creative idea of happy accident. You wanted to respond to that, Aby?
Yes, very much. Artistically, I'm incredibly interested in accident, and I'm also incredibly interested in failure. And I think for me, failure and accident are really kind of one and the same, really. And failure is something I've been interested throughout my whole practice. Sorry, can you remind me of the question? I'm finding it a bit difficult to remember these questions.
That's okay. That's okay. I think you've kind of responded to that one. Do you see the potential for accident a source of creativity? I'm thinking of the creative idea of happy accident.
Yes. I mean, I think if I didn't understand accident and failure as sources of creative capacity, I actually don't know if I would have a practice. I feel like actually interrogating happy, and because a lot of the work I do comes from play and improvisation, and I'm interested in the slippages that happen in those spaces as well. So yeah, I think for me, it's very much a crux of my practice.
Thanks, Aby. We've got a question from Beth. Beth says, so many questions are coming up for me. Here's one. I know this may not necessarily be a part of your PhD, as in constituting a specific focus, but do you feel there's a need to develop a particular notation system or similar in recording a dyspraxic dance practice? How can the practice best be recorded, saved, and shared? Good question, Beth.
Very, very good question. Scoring is a huge part of the way that I make work and the way that I choreograph things, because I am a very visual person. And for me, notating it down on paper and making it into a visual shape or a score or my own note, I have a style of my own notation. It is an incredibly important way for me to memorize the material and understand the material. However, that is something that works for me. And I know that the way that I notate things maybe wouldn't be accessible for another person. So I would definitely say that there is a way of notating my personal practice, and I do that a lot. But I wouldn't create a standardized system of my way of notating things, because I feel like that would go against my the essence of what I'm doing, I guess. And I would encourage other people to find ways of notating and scoring that work for them. And I could give strategies to that, but I definitely wouldn't be standardizing any sort of notation, because then that becomes another system that might not work for somebody.
Thanks, Aby. We've got a question from Benedict Phillips. Welcome, Benedict. Benedict's question is, do you want to change the world, and do you wish to change the way the world sees the dyspraxic being?
Yes. I know it's obviously a big thing to like want to change the world, but I do feel like my research has the capacity to make significant shifts. And I know that if my research and my work had existed when I was going through dance training when I was 16, that would have been, my life would be very different if I'd had this knowledge then. So yeah, I definitely think that a big part of my PhD is seeking change, which I think which is really, really important to dyspraxic people. Even having a dyspraxic voice within academia is, an outwardly facing dyspraxic voice anyway, talking about dyspraxic experience is quite a innovative thing. So I keep getting distracted by these chat things and it keeps making me lose my thought.
That's okay, that's okay. We've actually, we've not got very much time left, so, if there's questions, there's a few questions from the same people, so I might just move on to somebody that we've not had a question from before, if that's okay. Yep. Andrew asks about Crip time, which I think many of us have become aware of through the current situation we're going through. This presentation too is radically different in terms of accessibility than it may have been if presented at another time. What lessons would you like the dance and art worlds to take away as the world changes?
Yes, the idea that time is not a fixed fixed entity, but actually people exist in different temporal experiences, and people exist in different temporal experiences. Sorry, Tom's putting something in front of my screen that's really distracting. Time exists in different temporal... Sorry, can you ask me the question again? Sorry.
No problem. So you're talking about Crip time. Andrew says many of us have become aware of it through the current situation we're going through. The presentation's radically different in terms of accessibility. What lessons would you like the dance and art worlds to take away as the world changes?
Yes. So, as I said, I feel like the mainstream world is now having this realization that time can exist in different ways for different people, and the normal idea of what happens within a certain time frame does not apply to everybody, and there needs to be an understanding of that, I think, definitely within art and performance discourse. And sorry, I keep losing my chain of thought here. This is a very interesting experience because sorry.
That is, please don't worry. Don't worry at all. Your answers have been great. We're almost out of time as well. Can I select one final question for you, Aby? Would that be okay? So Sam asks, what was your biggest, what did you find out through the work of Ish? And maybe if I can also, I suppose I would also like to ask, what will you be taking forward from Ish?
What will I be taking forward from Ish? Oh my goodness I think the main thing, I very much came in to making Ish with a normative aesthetic in my mind, and thought that I could use that, or use, like at the start of Ish, I was doing lots of even balletic movements and lot of choreographic language that is more traditional and normative, and that isn't perhaps in my body. And I think coming out of it, I'm realizing that I have so much potential to mine my own bodily understanding and my own movement vocabularies and way of moving and way of being as a dyspraxic dance artist. And I think coming out of it, the big thing is that I'm so much more excited about mining what that inherent essence of myself as a dancer is, rather than trying to replicate what a good dance is. Because a lot of the process, there was a particular moment where Laura will remember, myself, Laura Bradshaw and Laura Bissell in a room, and I just shared some material with them, and I was crying my eyes out. And I was just going, I want it to be good. I want it to be good. And they said, well, what does good mean? And then I was like, yes, I'm very much still holding myself to these, to a standard which isn't embodied in me. So I'm thinking, what is my embodiment? What is my embodied dyspraxic experience, and what movements and choreographies come from that, rather than trying to replicate what I've seen and understand as successful. Yes, so definitely that, mining my own individuality as a dancer, and that as a source of choreographic creativity.
I think you've also responded to Tim's question there about somebody else dancing your work, or is it Aby specific? I think you've maybe responded to that a little bit in terms of feeling like it is Aby specific. We are out of time. I know there's a couple of other questions there, and it would be great to be able to pass these questions on to Aby, because there's some really interesting ones there in terms of what it is to take up space in disability dance culture. You were talking about not wanting to take up too much space as a neurodiverse artist. But I think in terms of time, we're going to have to stop there. I just want to say a huge thank you to Aby for sharing her work. It's been a fantastic talk. Thank you all also to the attendees. It's been a really great turnout and lovely to see some familiar faces or names. A big thank you also to Stephanie Edwards, who's done such a great job of programming these weekly talks. So next week's exchange talk will be on Monday, the 1st of June at 6 p.m. And it's James Slimming's Virtual Choir, a perceptual comparison of synchronous and asynchronous individual track recordings mixed together for performance purposes. So very, very finally, I would encourage you to take a look at the website and also the RKA Twitter page for further updates. It's at RCS_the exchange. And there's also a new RKA blog called The Green Room, which you can find on the RCS homepage on the website. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you, Aby. And we'll see you next week.